Now, Guy Peartree, I first met a year ago on Nantucket when he was delivering his one-man play at the invitation of the Nantucket Historical Society and Athenaeum and African American Meeting House. He took the very stage where Douglass made his first public speech during the 1841 Anti-Slavery Convention. Which brings us back to this date. As of yesterday, that was the anniversary of Douglass's speech. And again, it was the first time he spoke to a gathering of abolitionists and a white audience. And he said, it was with the utmost difficulty that I could stand erect, or that I could command and articulate 2 words without hesitation and stammering. While his speech may have been halting, it had immediate impact, and leaders in the Massachusetts Anti-Slavery Society invited him back. And they worked with him, and he quickly established himself as a formidable orator. And within 5 years, Douglass had a national and an international reputation. He wrote 3 autobiographies, edited several newspapers, and took a leading role in the women's movement, serving for half a century as an untiring advocate for racial justice. It's my great pleasure to present to you Frederick Douglass.
Good evening, my friends, my countrymen. I extend my gratitude to the Tales of Cape Cod Abolitionist Society, the anti-slavery movement that has been spawned in this area. I come to you with a heavy heart, for at this moment, I'm being pursued by 2 United States Marshals who are going to arrest me for my alleged participation in the Harper's Ferry attack on October 16th, 1859. A man by the name of John Brown, with a small band of men, attacked Harper's Ferry, Virginia, with the purpose of seizing the armaments, distributing them amongst the slaves, and thereby fomenting an insurrection against the slave system. John Brown had come to me and asked me to lead this insurrection. I told John Brown that it was against all sanity, that he was walking into a powder keg, and that it would blow up all around him. And indeed, John Brown was caught. And John Brown was accused of treason. And John Brown was hung until dead. On his way to the gallows, John Brown had one last statement to make in his life. I do believe the sins of this country are so great that they will come down like hell against the entire establishment of this country. John Brown has become a premonition that thousands of men will lay down their lives to defeat this God-forsaken system of slavery. And I, too, Frederick Douglass, a meager escaped slave, I, too, have become a premonition. Should I say I have become a specter, the nightmare of the slave master? For what is it that a slave master hates more than anything else in the world? He hates that a man such as myself would steal himself away and become his own agent, become his own voice, become his own man. All of those slave masters who have died are turning over in their graves because I escaped from slavery and because I speak the truth about slavery. Do you all know what the truth about slavery is? About any enslavement of any other being, by any other being? Yes. The truth is staring us in the face. In order for an individual, a man, a woman, to enslave another, that man or woman must strive day and night to destroy the humanity of his downcast brother and sister. And when you attempt to destroy the humanity of another human being, you destroy your own in that very same motion. That is the truth of slavery that the slave masters don't want you to hear. They think that we are happy and content being enslaved, that we, us sable folk, us black people, us brown-skinned people, just love to dance and sing, and that slavery is our natural condition. No man, woman, or child is content being enslaved. And I am here to bear witness to that truth. You know, when I was a child, some people might think this is a fire tonic. But it's actually innocuous. It's the flow of water. When I was a child, I did not know that I was a slave. I had to learn about slavery in a very vehement way. My earliest memories of my grandmother Betsy, I would see her out there in the waters, seine hauling, they called it, in the waters of the river with her net. I remember Grandma Betsy, a famous fishing woman in those parts, throwing her nets out over the water. And as she did so, she created a rhythmical melody, a charming melody. The waters of Jordan are flowing to Zion, flowing home to my Lord. The waters of Jordan are flowing to Zion, flowing home to my Lord. Not only was she a famous fishing woman in those parts, she was a famous planting woman in those parts. They said that no seed would go into the ground unless Grandma Betsy's hands had blessed them with the holiness of her touch. All the farmers for miles around would hire her so that she would elevate those seeds into their wonderful growth in spirit. She was a midwife. She caught babies. None of those babies ever died because of her magic hands. I thought I was a king on earth living with my Grandma Betsy. I did not know I was a slave. But one day, Grandma Betsy come to me and she say, Fred, you see the little hut I live in and all the children I take care after? You all can hear me, can't you? And the sky, you see how far that sky reaches up? Well, imagine the land stretching as far as the sky. That's how much land is owned by our old master. And she said old master with a degree of reverence that I had never heard her say before. Old master. We belong to old master, she said. Everything you see around here, as far as you can see, belonged to old Massa. Who is old Massa? In my child's mind, I thought she was talking about God, the master of the universe. Little did I know she was talking about a very strange evil that has embraced this world, the world of enslavement of humans by other humans. So she said to me, Fred, let's go meet your kinfolk up at the main plantation. We got to walk about 12 miles now, so come on, let's go. And as we walked through the byways and the highways of that gnarled jungle of the South, the old South, I thought I saw a lion coming at me. And I said, Grandma, you see the lion coming? Your imagination runs away with you when you're a little boy and you don't know what's going on around the corners. That ain't no lion, Fred. Yes, it is, Grandma. Pick me up. So she picked me up and put me on her shoulders. And she walked over and said, look, that ain't no lion. That's an old tree stump. It's been pulled up out of the ground in a storm, and it kind of has a mane like a lion, but it ain't no lion, Fred. Your imagination has run away with itself. And she kept me on her shoulders and she walked. Because, Grandma, I'm scared. There might be a bear or there might be anything coming. So she kept me up on her shoulders and she walked, and you wouldn't know that my grandma was an old woman except you could see a little white hair coming out of her scarf. And as we approached the main plantation, I said, Grandma, look at all them youngins. She said, yes, and all them youngins is your kinfolk. Let me down. I feel good. You should feel good. I just carried you for 4 miles on my shoulders. Grandma, them folks, them kinfolk, they're wild. Of course they're wild. All children are wild, except you. But Grandma, I don't want to go play with them because they're too wild. Go play with them, Fred. Get away from my petticoats. You've been around me all these days. You don't know what it's like to be with other children like them. There's your brother Perry, your sister Eliza, and your cousin Jethro. Go play with them. So reluctantly, I went to play with my kinfolk. And my kinfolk were indeed ruffians and tough as nails. I saw boys running on their hands faster than I could run on my feet. You've seen those kinds of boys, haven't you? Agile, strong. I saw boys throwing rocks up at birds flying across the sky. They threw it so fast and so precise, they hit the bird right dead center. I said, these kinfolk of mine, they are beyond my understanding. But then one of my cousins, he comes skipping into the yard. He says, Fred, I got to tell you something, Fred. What's that? Your grandmama is gone. What do you mean she's gone? She's just gone. And I went looking for my grandma. I looked to the east, I looked to the west, I looked north and south, and my grandma had disappeared. She had that Indian blood, and she knew how to disappear. She wouldn't let anybody find her if she wanted to disappear and never be seen again. Where's my grandma? She wasn't gonna leave me here. And my brother Perry, he come up behind me and he said, here, take this peach and pear. I said, why? He said, because your grandmama is gone. And I took the peach and pear and I threw it as far as I could. I want my grandma. I want my grandma. Fred, your grandmama had to leave you here just like she left all these other children, and myself included. She had to leave you here because we belong to old Massa. He's the one that owns us. He tells us where to go. He tells us how to do, how to be. He has control over every facet of our lives. That's why you was here. It was your time to come to the main plantation. And I broke down in tears right in front of my brother. Why would they do this to me? And I finally understood what it meant to be a slave. That you did not have your own being in front of you. That your grandma or your mother or your father can be taken from you. That you could be sold. That you weren't your own being. Could you think of a more powerful evil than that? To take a child away from his loving kinfolk? And so I was ushered into the wonderful kitchen that Aunt Katie ran like a ship's captain. Aunt Katie was a mean sort of woman who took a special dislike to me. Right away. All I had to do was come in there with my eyes all full of curiosity, and she said, "You got to stop looking up like that, because the master's going to slap that look right out of your face." So I think she was trying to teach me something, that a mean-spirited way to teach you was the way that all slaves had to obey. But she really treated me unfairly. One day, she took an entire loaf of cornbread and cut it up into 16 pieces. Us 16 boys, we lived in her kitchen. When I say we lived in her kitchen, we slept in her kitchen, we played in her kitchen, we ate in her kitchen, we did everything in that kitchen. She took the 16 pieces of cornbread and gave them to each one of the boys, but the 16th piece that was supposedly mine, she took it outside and she started tearing little bits of it off and throwing it to the mean cussed roosters that were out there. So was I going to go fight a rooster over my little piece of cornbread? I could not do that. I wanted to save my skin from being pecked to death. And I said, "Why are you doing this to me? Why are you not giving me the cornbread?" And she said, "I hope you starve." Well, you could see how that could break a child's spirit, can't you? So I went out the back and I cried like a fine fella. That whole day I was searching for food. In the evening, at the end of the day, I decided that I was going to find me some corn kernels and I was going to put them near the fire and roast them so that I could have something in my stomach. As I was looking for the corn kernels and as I put them in the flames of the stove, the door opened. I thought it was Aunt Katie's door, but no, it was the outside door. And that door opened and a visitation by someone I haven't told you about yet come walking into the kitchen. And it was like the wind was taken out of my lungs and put in my lungs at the same time. Suppose I told you that you met a person. Suppose I were to tell you that there's a person that I know who hasn't seen his mother in 4 years. And suppose I tell you that that person was hungry as anything, and all of a sudden, the door opens and your mother is standing right in front of you. That being that I haven't told you about, my mother, she had been farmed out. I hadn't seen her in years. Farmed out to other farms, and she never had a chance to come visit me, but she came that night, the night that I was hungry. And she said, "Fred, you don't look good. What's the matter with you, child?" That was my mother, Harriet, saying this to me. "You don't look good. You look hungry." And I told her what Aunt Katie did to me. That she wouldn't give me the bread, and that she said that I hope you starve. And my mother, she just swelled up like a mother bear. Have you ever seen a mother bear swell up? And you could see the venom coming out of my mother's eyes. She stormed into Katie's room, Aunt Katie's room, and woke her up out of her dead sleep and said, "Don't you ever let me hear you doing this to my son again. Because if I was to die this very night, I would come back and I would haunt you." And I could hear the wind being knocked out of Aunt Katie's body. And my mother stormed back into the kitchen and she said, "Fred, I'm going to get you something to eat." She come back with a whole quart of milk in the middle of the night. And she made me some gingerbread, not just cornbread. And she rocked me in a rocking chair. She put a blanket over me. And she sang songs to me and put me to sleep. But when I woke up, I was on the floor. My mother was gone. She had to be at her plantation first thing in the morning. So she must have left in the wee hours of the morning just to be back at sunrise at her plantation. I'll always remember the fact that my mother come and saved me from the jaws of the lion, that she loved me so deeply that even on her last legs on this earth, she came to be with her son. For I found out years later that my mother had a premonition of dying, and she come to be with me before she passed away. So Aunt Katie took a special dislike to me, like I said, but Miss Lucretia, the slave master's daughter, she took a special liking to me. And Miss Lucretia and I discovered years later that Miss Lucretia and I were related by blood, for the master was her father and my father. Little did I know at the time. So her special liking of me came out of her being of the same blood. And she said, Fred, I've decided that I'm going to send you to Baltimore so that you can become a gentleman farmer and find yourself a gentleman occupation. I'm going to send you to be with my brother-in-law, Hugh, and his wife. And you're going to take care of their son, and you're going to learn a trade. So she sent me off to Baltimore, told me to get myself scrubbed clean, which I did. 3 days, I scrubbed myself in the river. And on my way to Baltimore, I was on the board with sheep, and the sheep were just all night long. Have you ever tried to sleep with sheep, all night long? I didn't get much sleep. On my way to the new home, I had to keep my head down all the while I was walking through the avenues of Baltimore. Now, why you suppose a young black boy such as myself should keep his head down? When I tell this story to young children, they give me some really good answers. I said, because I'm not supposed to look at a white person in the eyes. Because if you do look at a white person in the eyes, that shows that you are standing your ground and being equal to them. And then they want you to look down and be lower than them. Interesting perception, don't you think? So I came to the home of Hugh and Sophia Auld, and I knocked on the door, and I had my head way down. But the lady who came to the door said, "Look at you, son, don't put your face down like that." And she took her hand and lifted me up, and I thought I was looking into the eyes of an angel. She said, "You have to look up where God is, where the light of love is. Don't look down." And she was a transformative woman in my life. Miss Sofa, I called her. She came into my life like a star shining bright. And she would sit down with her little son on her knee, and I would stand over her, and she would open up the good book, and she would take those words off that page and put them in her mouth and let them come out. You know, she was reading. And I said, "Miss Sofa, how do you do that? How do you get the words in your mouth and put them out there like that?" She said, "Son, you don't know how to read?" I said, "No, ma'am." "Well, let me start," she said. "A boy your size should be learning how to read." And so she, as they would say in old English parlance, she taught me the rudiments of reading. And I learned how to spell any word I saw. And one day I started picking out the words, "The Lord is my shepherd, I shall not want." And she was so proud of me. She said, "Wait, I'm going to call my husband in and show him what you're doing. Hugh, look what Fred can do." And so Hugh come in, he says, what's he doing? And so I pick up the book, and he looks at me with askance like, "Huh?" And I said, "The Lord is my," and I look at his face and shut my mouth. I couldn't say shepherd because the way he looked, it looked like he was going to kill me. He took the book out of my hand and he knocked it down on the table. He said, "Get your expletive out of here," says he. And so I did. And I heard him say, "Don't you ever teach no slave how to read." it will forever unfit him to be a slave. And if you teach him how to read, his mind is going to run away with itself. And he's going to want to learn how to write. And there will be no stopping him from putting all kinds of false notions and crazy notions in his head. A slave should know only the will of his master and obey it. Besides, if you teach them to read and they find out, I could be put in jail and fined $200. Now, do you want that to happen to your peaceful little household? But I heard him say it over and over again in my mind. If you teach him how to read, it will forever unfit him to be a slave. It was like a never-ending phrase that kept turning over and over in my mind. If you teach him how to read, why would it unfit me to be a slave? What is it about reading and slavery that they don't mix? What is it? My mind was forever turned toward understanding what that meant. And so Miss Sophia, she hadn't understood this. She was married into the slave system. She wasn't from the slave system. She was a fine Christian woman who held her own. Then she married into it, and now she had to learn the logic of inhumanity, of taking humanity from others so that you could profit from their enslavement. And so the woman who was my angel became my arch enemy. That woman who wanted to encourage me to read, she finally turned against me and would run into the room screaming, "Are you trying to read in here quiet by yourself?" I said, "No, ma'am." She says, "Forget everything I taught you." But I couldn't forget. I went outside and I played games in the dirt with young boys. I said, "I know how to spell this word," and I would spell out a word, and if it was wrong, they would correct me. I must have learned 1,000 words just by playing word in the dirt with my friends. And little Tommy, the little boy that I was taking care of, on the days that he was away at school, I'd find his spelling books and I would copy word for word everything that he had put down so that I could spell and have good penmanship. I was educating myself despite the fact that they didn't want me to learn to read. Reading became an all-time obsession for me. I kept learning to read over and over again. But my fate would change, and I was sent back to that plantation. The lady who took so much joy and promise in me, she had passed away, Miss Lucretia. The master wanted to redistribute his property. I was one of his pieces of property. He wanted to put me someplace that would be financially successful for him. But when I came back, I was kind of a loose cannon, so to speak. I was obstreperous. You all know what obstreperous means. You don't listen to what they tell you to do. You do it your own way. And he says, "I ain't got time to be beating on you," he said. "I'm getting too old for that. But I'm going to send you to a place where they're going to teach you how to be a proper slave." Did you know they had a university of proper slavedomness? It was called Covey's Farm. Mr. Covey was a slave breaker. And a slave breaker is very similar to a horse breaker, even though they've discovered hundreds of years later that the best way to break a horse is not to break him at all, but to be mentally and emotionally connected to that horse so that he will just calm down on his own vibration. But no, they don't believe that in this slave system. They believe in brutality, and they believe in whipping you until you are no longer capable of having your own sense of being. And that is exactly what happened to me during my time at Mr. Covey's farm. Anything that I did became an infringement in his eyes, and he would beat me until I couldn't move. Day in and day out, Mr. Covey was called a snake in the grass. He would say he was going to town, and the slave said, "No, he ain't going to town." He goes out a couple of miles down the road, and he sneaks back, and he gets into the grass and he looks around just like a snake, seeing what all the different slaves are doing on his plantation. So he's always beating on somebody for their infringements. It was one day that this came to a head. We were threshing wheat in the big hot sun. It was the end of the summer and the sun was really, really hot. It might have been 120 degrees or more. And I was the first on this line of slaves throwing the wheat from one person to the other, and so that they could chafe it out. But I became very sick at one point, and I could no longer hold my stomach in. I became almost, I had to let it out. And the sun was beating on my head so strong that my head was swooning around like when you see stars, like somebody had hit me. And so I went over to a tree and got some shade, and Mr. Covey said, "What's going on here? Why is the work stopping?" "Fred is sick," someone said. "Oh, is he?" And he went over to me and he started kicking me to get me up. But I was too sick to get up out of that position. I was too sick to even know who I was at that moment. And so he kicks me one real good hard kick right in the side of my head, and the blood starts spurting out. It was a good thing that I had thick hair at that time in my life, thicker than it is now, and the blood clotted in my head. But as the blood was leaving and clotting, I became very, very convinced that Mr. Covey was going to kill me if he came back again. And all I could do to help myself was to get up and run as fast as I could and get away from Mr. Covey. When you know that you're about to die, you do phenomenal things to save your life. Getting away from Mr. Covey was the only thing I could think of at that moment, and I ran into the bushes. He looked around, he spit on the ground. He knew that I couldn't get too far, because he knew that if he didn't get me, one of the wild animals would, or I would bleed to death. See, he doesn't care about me. He doesn't care about anybody. But I found my way to the plantation of my master. I came looking like death warmed over, if you know what that phrase means. I came looking like I was a monster from the Black Lagoon, if you know what that means. And there I was, with blood all over me, and I had mud all over me, and I had these sucking things all over me. They were sucking the blood out of me. And the women were screaming. They were saying, look at Fred, what's going on with him?" And the master says, "What are you doing here?" I said, "Mr. Covey has tried to kill me." "Mr. Covey tried to kill you?" "No, he ain't gonna kill you. But you know what? I'm gonna kill you if you're not back there first thing in the morning. You get yourself cleaned up, and you get your little twerp thing back where you need to go." So that night, I cleaned myself up. And the next day, I pretended I was going to Covey's farm. And I walk out with a little bit of food that the slave women gave me. And I made my way to a nice little meadow. And there was a nice little brook flowing by. And it put me into a deep sleep. Such a very deep sleep that I had a dream that a snake was coming up out of that deep water. And that snake was coming up and putting itself around my feet and legs. And when I woke up in a start, there was a man standing there. He says, "Oh, I didn't mean to wake you up." His hand was on my foot. That's why I thought there was a snake. I thought it was Covey. He says, No, I'm not Mr. Covey. I'm your friend Sandy." "Oh, yes, Sandy." Sandy was an African, a pure-blooded African, who had been in this country for 6 years. He came over on a slave boat, but he was never, ever in anybody's enslaved position. He was always free, and nobody ever knew why he was always free. And he says, "I come to tell you why I'm always free." And I said, "How are you always free?" He said, he goes into his pocket, and he pulls out this root. He says, "I brought this over from Africa. They didn't know I had it. I kept it safe from them knowing it. And I planted a root. And this root gives you strength of character, gives you strength of purpose. I'm going to give you this root. No man has ever beat me or put his hand on me successfully since I've had this root in my right-hand pocket. And I'm going to give it to you." I said, I don't believe in superstition. He says, "This is not superstition. You are from a men who are warriors, a country, a tribe. All of those folk from our past are warriors. Take this route and become the warrior that you have always been. So he held me with his eyes. I was under his spell, and I put the root in my right-hand pocket. And he says, now get to Covey's farm. So I got to Covey's farm, and it was Sunday morning, actually, when I got there. Everybody was getting ready to go to their Sunday meeting, their revival meetings. Even Mr. Covey was diligent and pious. And when he saw me, he didn't say anything to me like, where the hell you been, or I'm going to beat you. He just tipped his hat to me and said, good morning. Praise the Lord. Praise the Lord. After what you did to me. And when he come back early in the afternoon, actually it was in the evening when he came back. It was late at night, and all the slaves were dancing and singing. You could hear the trembling and the moaning and the salvation singing. Oh, my soul was new when I came out the wilderness. My soul was new when I came out the wilderness. I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness, leaning on the Lord. I said I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness. I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness. I loved everybody when I came out the wilderness, leaning on the Lord. There he was, leaning on the Lord. Mr. Covey himself. Mr. Covey was leaning on the Lord. Do you believe it? Oh my God, I said. I know what's going to happen. He's going to free us now. Because once you get the Spirit of the Lord in you, woo! And nothing is stopping you now. The Spirit of the Lord is saying, let my people go. And Mr. Covey is going to say, I'm going to let these people go. Yes, I know that's what he's going to do. The next morning he says, wake up, Fred. I want to go to town. I want you to get those horses ready for me. Early in the morning, 5 a.m., I start brushing the horses down and getting them ready, to hooking them up to go to town. And then he says, when he comes in, he says, now, you got the horses ready? Now I want you to go into the other side of the barn. Take your clothes off, because I'm going to beat you within 1 inch of your life. And then my sense of resurrection was plummeted into a sense of decay in one fell swoop. I said, I ain't taking my clothes off. He says, you mean to resist me? And he comes charging at me with the ropes on him. And he's going to put the ropes around me, hang me upside down, and start beating me. That's what he wanted to do. Have you ever heard of such a foul thing to do to another human being? But my arms, like a mule, went out. And I got him around the neck. And my arms were so strong and so tight that the blood left his whole face, and he knelt down like he couldn't breathe. And he started calling out, Robert, come help me. Get this boy off of me. And Robert comes running, and Robert was one of the slave hirees that didn't like to do much work. And he says, what do you want me to do? Get the boy off of me. He says, I wasn't hired to help you beat on nobody. And he ran away. George, come, George, help me get this boy off of me. George, nice rotund man, he come wide like so, getting ready to get me. But not only did I have 2 hands, I had 2 legs. And as he came at me, I hit him in his ribs so hard that the wind was knocked out of him. I became a fighter to extreme degree in this one instant of my life. And there was Covey going down on his knees. And Robert wasn't going to do anything. And George couldn't do anything. So he called out, Caroline! And Caroline was the cook on the plantation. And she was a wide, beautiful woman. And she come in sashaying like, what you want me to do? Get this boy off of me! And she looked at him in the eyes, and she looked at me. And the spirit of defiance swept over her too. I ain't doing nothing. Says she. It was me and Covey, one-on-one. For 2 hours we wrestled. Have you ever wrestled anybody for 2 hours? The sweat was enormous. Mr. Covey had blood around his neck. I had drawn the blood from his neck. But there was no blood coming off of me. And as we fell apart in our exhausted state of combat, he said, I would have beat you better if you hadn't resisted so much. And the truth is, he hadn't beaten me at all. I was the one who kept charge of that fight. And so I understood in that moment what the slave master does to keep all of his slaves in check. He inspires you, incites you with the fear of death. And if death is hanging over your head, it makes you kowtow and do anything. But in that moment of defeat, I was no longer afraid to die. And Covey could see it in my eyes. He could have 10 men coming at me, and all of them would get hurt if they came at me. He knew that, and I would not go down with my head between my knees. I would go down with my head straight up in the air. My manhood breathed back into my body. And that look that I had in my eyes when Covey was beating on me, that look that made me sit down at the edge of the water where the boats were going by, and I would say, oh my God, if only I could be one of those boats and get myself out of here, if only I could die. No longer was the case. My manhood breathed itself back into me, and I was no longer afraid to die, and I was no longer afraid to live, and I was going to take life by the horns and become a man. Covey never reported this infringement. I think he was afraid his reputation would have been sullied. But I was sent back to Baltimore. My fate did change another time. Back in Baltimore, an Irishman on the docks, they saw me working hard, going from one job to the next, and they said, you know, you should get yourself on the Underground Railroad. And I found the Underground Railroad. And I did get myself on the Underground Railroad, so that the money that I gave my master would no longer be his, but mine. I made my way to Boston in 1838. In Massachusetts, I could smell the freedom of this wonderful state of Massachusetts. And I had 3 children, right in a row. That's what freedom does to you. And in 1841, I was invited to go speak at an abolitionist meeting in Nantucket. And I was kind of tender and kind of new. I had been working in New Bedford on my preaching skills, but I had never spoken to a very, very well-educated audience, all white folks. William Lloyd Garrison said to me, we heard that you were a good speaker. Come, tell us about your life. Honestly, I don't remember if I said anything coherently, but I do know what I did say at the end of my speech. I said, at the end of her life, my Aunt Betsy, whose body had peopled and suckled the mouths of countless babes of the masters. This woman who had been so faithful to her master. At the end of her life, when she was 90-something years old and going blind, they put her out in a little shack all by herself. They were treating her like refuse. No one to help her, no one to be with her. All those people that she loved, she was by herself. William Lloyd Garrison jumped up. He said, "Are we going to let this man, this wonderful speaker of a man, be treated like refuse?" And 400 strong, the people started shouting and stomping, "No, no, no! Are we going to let him become an abolitionist and speak out against slavery?" And they all shouted, "Yes, yes, yes." And the tears in my eyes started to swell up in my eyes, to well up in my eyes. And I knew at that moment who I am, who I became, and who I've always been. I, Frederick Douglass, escaped from the jaws of slavery to the freedom of the North. And because I am a man, I am an abolitionist. Thank you very much.